Radioactive iodine experiments in Alaska. In 1956 and 57, the U.S. Air Force studied the thyroid gland in acclimatizing humans to cold weather using iodine 131. The study was done at the Arctic Aeromedical Laboratory in Alaska. This study was conducted on groups of people who were ignorant of the fact that modern American medicine posed ethical problems. Who was in the study? The study engaged 120 participants in this experiment. The ages ranged from 16 to 90 years old. The participants were administered 200 doses of iodine 131 to 120 subjects. Charts in the report indicate slightly different subject numbers, with some subjects participating more than once. Previous studies with animals proposed that the thyroid gland could play an essential function in acclimatizing to extreme cold weather. This experiment was part of the laboratory's larger research mission to examine ways of improving the operational capability of Air Force personnel in Arctic regions. Many observational studies of Alaskan natives were carried out by various researchers in the 1950s and 60s. Most of these researchers did not administer radiation to the natives, but only measured what had already accumulated in their bodies from the fallout. The thyroid study discussed here differed in that it had actively administered radionuclides to natives. The Alaskan I-131 experiment also offered subjects no prospect of medical benefit. What is iodine 131? An important radioisotope of iodine was discovered by two scientists in 1938 at the University of California in Berkeley. It has a radioactive decay half-life of about 8 days. It is associated with nuclear energy, medical diagnostic and treatment procedures, and natural gas production. It also plays a major role as a radioactive isotope present in nuclear fission products and as a significant contributor to the health hazards from open-air atomic bomb testing in the 1950s and Chernobyl, as well as large fraction of the contamination hazard in the first weeks in the Fukushima nuclear crisis. When iodine 131 is present in high levels in the environment from radioactive fallout, it can be absorbed through contaminated food and will also accumulate in the thyroid. As it decays, it may cause damage to the thyroid. The primary threat from exposure to iodine 131 is an increased risk of radiation-induced cancer in later life. Recently it has been known that much smaller incidental doses of iodine 131 than those used in medical therapeutic procedures are supposed by some studies to be the major cause of increased thyroid cancers after accidental nuclear contamination. These studies suppose that cancers happen from residual tissue radiation damage caused by iodine 131 and should appear mostly years after exposure, long after the iodine 131 has decayed. What BACB codes were or would have been violated in this case? The iodine 131 experiment in Alaska, which involved the deliberate release of radioactive iodine to study the effects of radiation on human health, would have violated several ethic codes and guidelines of the Behavior Analyst Certification Board. Some of the BACB codes that were or would have been violated in this experiment include responsibility to clients. Behavior analysts must prioritize the welfare of their clients and ensure that their interventions are in the client's best interest. The deliberate release of radioactive iodine would have put the health and safety of the people in the surrounding areas at risk, violating this ethical code. Ethical leadership. Behavior analysts in leadership positions have responsibility to promote ethical behavior and ensure that ethical guidelines are followed. Those in charge of the Iodine 131 experiment did not adhere to ethical principles, and the experiment was carried out without proper informed consent from the affected individuals. Competence. Behavior analysts must maintain their competence and only provide services that are within their scope of competence. Conducting an experiment involving radioactive materials requires specialized knowledge and training. It is unlikely that the researchers involved in the Iodine 131 experiment had the necessary expertise. Integrity. Behavior analysts must promote honesty, transparency, and accuracy in their work. Deliberately exposing people to radioactive iodine without their informed consent clearly violates this ethical code. Overall, the Iodine 131 experiment in Alaska would have violated several ethical codes and guidelines of the BACB, including the responsibility to clients, ethical leadership, competence, and integrity. It is important for behavior analysts to uphold these ethical principles and prioritize the welfare and safety of clients. What should have been done differently? Several things should have been done differently in the Iodine 131 experiment in Alaska to ensure that ethical guidelines were followed and the welfare of the people in the surrounding areas were protected. Here are some of the things that should have been done differently. 1. Informed consent. The researchers should have obtained informed consent from the affected individuals before carrying out the experiment. This would have allowed individuals to make an informed decision about whether to participate in and understand the potential risks involved. 2. The risk assessment. Before conducting the experiment, a thorough risk assessment should have been carried out to determine the potential risk to the people in the surrounding areas. If the risks were deemed to be too great, the experiment should not have been carried out. 3. Expertise. Researchers involved in the experiment should have had the necessary expertise and training to handle radioactive materials and conduct experiments involving radiation. It is important only to conduct experiments that fall within one's scope of competence. 4. Monitoring. Once the experiment was conducted, the researchers should have monitored the affected individuals for any adverse health effects and provided appropriate medical care if needed. 5. Transparency. The researchers should have been transparent about the experiment and its potential risks. The affected individuals should have been informed about the experiment and its purpose and given the opportunity to ask questions and voice any concerns. Overall, the Iodine 131 experiment in Alaska should have been carried out with greater care and consideration for ethical principles. By obtaining informed consent, conducting a thorough risk assessment, ensuring the necessary expertise and training, monitoring the affected individuals, and promoting transparency, the experiment could have been carried out in a more ethical manner while still providing valuable scientific insight.